Good afternoon. As chairman of the Associated Student Speakers Program, I'd like to welcome you to our 5th program of the winter quarter. Our speaker today is the candidate for the presidency from the Socialist Workers' Party. Linda Jenness was the candidate for mayor of Atlanta in 1969 and her party's candidate for governor of Georgia the following year. In these campaigns, she pioneered in bringing socialist politics into the South. With the rise of the feminist movement, Linda Jenness has spoken widely on women's liberation. She has toured the U.S. speaking on the topic of why feminism is revolutionary. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce the candidate for the presidency of the Socialist Party, Linda Jenness.
As I have been traveling around the country in this campaign, I've been speaking out against the racism and the sexism, the injustice, the inhumanity of this society. And I've discovered that most of the people that I talk to agree with me that there has got to be some changes made. What people are thinking and talking about around the country is how we are going to bring about this change. Some people say that we can bring about this change by patching up and working within the two-party system. Others say that we must work outside of the two-party system and completely change it. That's the big question. The big question is, how can we be the most effective in 1972? Last fall, President Nixon addressed a joint session of Congress, and he made the following statement, and I quote, "The much maligned American system has produced more abundance, more widely shared, and more opportunity for more people than any other system, any time, any place. That system is what makes it possible for us to help the poor and feed the hungry and clean up our environment and meet all the great goals that we have set for ourselves as a nation. And we cannot accomplish these goals if we make the mistake of disparaging and undermining the system that produces America's wealth, of casting it in the light of an oppressor and exploiter of human beings." Well, that's clear enough. Nixon makes it quite clear that he doesn't think that we can be effective by working to despair and undermine the current system. He says that we must work within the system. What does he mean by the system? Very simply, what Nixon is talking about is the capitalist system, which is an economic and social system based on private property and the pursuit of profits. He's talking about a system where, according to the latest U.S. Treasury statistics, 2.2% of Americans own and control over 87% of the wealth of this country and over half of the wealth on a worldwide scale. And because they own it, they make all the decisions about it. This economic system, capitalism, has two political parties which represent and defend it, the Democratic and the Republican parties. That's what people mean when they talk about the system. And when they talk about working within the system, they're talking about working within the Democratic and the Republican parties. So when I talk today about working in and outside the system, that's what I'm talking about. Let's take a look at how effective it's been to work within the two-party system when it comes to one crucial issue facing Americans, the war in Southeast Asia. In 1964, the American people elected Lyndon Baines Johnson to office because he was the anti-war candidate against Goldwater. He said, you might remember, "No American boy will do the job that an Asian boy should do." He got elected and then escalated the war. In 1968, the American people elected Nixon to office because he was the peace candidate at the time. You might remember he had a secret plan to end the war. Since Nixon took office, the United States has dropped some 5.5 million tons of bombs, rockets, missiles, and cannon shells in Southeast Asia. This government has destroyed 6.5 billion board feet of commercial timber in Vietnam, which is a 31-year supply for that country. Nearly 1/7 of Vietnam has been sprayed with plant-killing herbicides. Over 1/2 million South Vietnamese civilians, approximately 30% of whom were under the age of 13, have been slaughtered, and almost 4% of the entire North Vietnamese population is dead. The Manchester Guardian described the Plaine de Jars in Laos as follows. It said, until recently, the area provided a living for a population of more than 20,000. Now it is empty and ravaged. In large areas, the original bright green has been destroyed and replaced by an abstract pattern of black and bright metallic colors. That's the result of President Nixon's secret plan to end the war. But now it's election time, and President Nixon's a peace candidate again. He's making one of his major campaign planks the myth that he is bringing an end to the war, or at least winding it down to an acceptable level. Nothing could be further from the truth. Nixon is trying to substitute bombs for troops in order to fool and trick the American people into believing that the war is over and to get the anti-war movement off the street. In Nixon's TV interview of January 3rd, you might have seen it, he said, and I quote, he always calls himself he. It's like a king, you know, they call themselves we. Well, Nixon says he's always doing everything he can in view of dealing with interests to protect American men and to get back Americans who are held. Nixon referred to the Vietnamese people as international outlaws. Here are a people who have fought for over 30 years for national independence, land reform, and maybe a second or a third meal a day. And Nixon calls them international outlaws. Now, it's like a man sitting in his home one day. 4 or 5 big brutes come in, break down the door, rape his wife, murder his children, steal all his belongings, and then when that man picks up a gun to shoot at those intruders, he's considered an outlaw and put in jail. Vietnamese people are not outlaws. It's Nixon and his henchmen who are international outlaws. And it's the capitalist system which requires that the United States intervene in over 80 countries around the world and is not on the right side in any one of them. Nowhere in the whole world is the United States government supporting a progressive cause. This government supports regimes like in Spain and Greece, supports them on the basis of whether or not they're friendly to American business interests. That means supporting military dictatorships, it means promoting counterinsurgency, and it means putting down struggles for national independence, such as in Bangladesh. Now, the different candidates of the Democratic and the Republican parties may, and in fact do, disagree over which method of U.S. intervention in Vietnam serves the best interests of U.S. foreign policy. But they all agree on the basic aim of American imperialism and on the right of the United States government to intervene, not only in Vietnam, but all around the world. In fact, George McGovern, who's one of the so-called peace candidates of the Democratic Party, had the following to say, and I quote, he said, "I'd send American troops anywhere our national and business interests warranted it, but only for 30 days, unless I had a full declaration of war." My point is that working within the two-party system is not the most effective thing that you can do if you're interested in helping people all around the world. Most notably right now, people in Vietnam, the Laotians, the Cambodians, the Bengali, the Palestinian refugees, or the Irish. On the contrary, to support the politicians from these two parties means support to this system and the continued oppression and subjugation of those people. Now, some people say to me, okay, these parties are rotten, but they have the power, and they're going to win. So what we have to do is get inside of them and try to take them over. That, incidentally, is the theory that's put forth by the Black Political Caucus, the Women's Political Caucus, and the Youth Caucus. Well, let's take a look at that. First of all, who controls the Democratic and the Republican parties? Time magazine of November 23rd reported that the average cost of winning a seat in the House of Representatives is about $500,000. A Senate seat costs about $1.5 million, and the governor's seat costs about $1 million. Those are just the average prices, but there's some very notable exceptions. Nelson Rockefeller, for instance, spent close to $10 million to win re-election as governor of New York. And Richard Ottinger, you may know, who was backed primarily by his mother, spent $3.5 million in the race for the Senate and then lost it. All of this campaign spending prompted the mayor of Buffalo, New York, to quite correctly describe himself when he was asked as the best mayor that money can buy. Political analysts are estimating that over $400 million will be spent in the 1972 presidential campaign. Now, where does all this money come from? Of course, each of the candidates insists that their money comes from crumpled $1 and $5 and $10 bills from the average person on the street. That's not true. The truth of the matter is that 90% of all political funds comes from about 1% of the population, big bankers, businessmen, and millionaires. That means, incidentally, that in order to get elected to office in this country, you either have to be a millionaire, like a Rockefeller or a Kennedy, or your program and your candidacy has to be acceptable to big businessmen and millionaires so that they'll give you the money that you need to run. The fact of the matter is that both of these parties are controlled from the top by a tiny group of people, and there's no way to take over the Democratic and the Republican parties or for the American people to control them. These parties weren't set up for that. They were set up for big business to control and for the American people to just vote for them. For instance, the average American who calls himself or herself a Democrat or a Republican isn't a party member, doesn't go to party meetings, doesn't participate in the decisions or the policy making of those parties. All he or she does is just pull the lever for them every 4 years. You know, people who think that the Democratic and the Republican parties can be reformed usually believe that those parties are democratic and that the elections in this country are somehow democratic. That's not true either. The elections in this country are undemocratic and unrepresentative from top to bottom. The election laws in most states make it difficult, if not impossible, for minority parties, third parties, parties like La Raza Unida, independent candidates to get on the ballot. For instance, the Socialist Workers' Party is planning to be on the ballot in 35 states in the Union this year. But in order to do that, we are going to have to collect over 500,000 signatures on independent nominating petitions, be involved in at least 10 legal suits that are very costly, and when all that's over, there will still be at least 15 states where it's impossible for us to file for ballot status. Spanish-speaking people, many of whom don't speak English, are provided a ballot totally in English. That excludes many of them from voting. Prisoners can't vote. Think of the hypocrisy of that. You know, if the Attica Rebellion proved anything, it proved, in my opinion, that the wrong people are filling our country's prisons. As Eugene Debs used to say, our court system is constructed so as to catch the minnows and let the whales through. The Attica prisoners and the prisoners all over this country are not only struggling for their own human dignity, but they're fighting the racism and the warped human values of all of this society. And there's no group of people, in my opinion, who have a better right to a say-so in how this country is run than these prisoners. Yet most of them are excluded from the ballot for life. Most high school students can't vote. The 26th Amendment gave the 18-year-olds the right to vote, but most of you are still excluded from running for office. There are all kinds of age and residency and filing fee requirements. There are residency requirements. GIs can't vote where they're stationed. In some states, there are still loyalty oaths that you have to take. Every trick imaginable is used to keep independent and third-party candidates off the ballot. The elections aren't democratic, and the capitalist system isn't democratic. For instance, the vast majority of Americans in this country are against the war, yet the war goes on. The majority of Americans are for repealing the archaic abortion laws, yet the abortion laws stand. The majority of the black community is for freeing Angela Davis, yet she's still in jail. None of us voted to have unemployment, yet there are over 6 million people unemployed in this country today. Nearly everyone in this country is for stopping pollution, yet the big factories and corporations continue to pour billions of tons of filth into our air and streams every day. It's not democracy. Democracy means that the American people, the people who live and work in this country, make all the decisions about it. In this society, a tiny handful of big businessmen, bankers, and millionaires make all of those decisions for you. You don't make any of the basic decisions about your own lives. Now, some of you may be thinking, okay, the elections aren't democratic. The Democratic and Republican parties aren't democratic. And the capitalist system isn't democratic. But you still have to be effective. And it's still better to elect a liberal Democrat than a conservative Republican. The fact of the matter is that it doesn't matter whether a McGovern or a Nixon is in office today. They both support the same basic system. They both belong to parties that are controlled from the top by the same group of people. And they can both say or promise anything they want during an election, because once they're in office, the American people have absolutely no control over them. For instance, I remember in 1964 when Johnson ran as the peace candidate against Goldwater. After Johnson was elected and escalated the war, everyone said, oh my goodness, Johnson is following Goldwater's program. The Socialist Workers' Party said, no, Johnson is not following Goldwater's program. Johnson is following Johnson's program, which is exactly the same as Goldwater's program and was all along, and something that we pointed out all during the elections. We said then, and we say now, that as long as these candidates support the capitalist system and the logical consequences of that system, they're going to be forced to exploit people both abroad and at home. You know, that's the whole strategy of the Democratic and the Republican parties. A Democrat gets into office and does a rotten job. So they say, okay, you don't like the Democrats, elect the Republicans. So you elect a Republican and he does the same rotten job. And so they say, well, if you don't like the Republicans, elect the Democrats again. Democrats, Republicans, Republican, Democrats. That's the whole two-party lesser evil system. I know that this year the big thing is to dump Nixon. But the only way they're going to dump Nixon in 1972 is by electing a Democrat into office. If you elect a Democrat into office, come 1976, you're going to have to dump the dumper of Nixon because he won't be any better, any more than Johnson was better than Goldwater. I point out that the only people in this country, other than the socialists, who have had the guts to stand up like human beings and say we won't be fooled and tricked by these Democrats any longer are the Chicano people, who broke away from the Democratic Party and have formed their own party, La Raza Unida Party. The only people who have had the guts to do that today, the first sector of society to break away from the Democratic Party. Actually, candidates of these two parties never talk about their program. Their whole strategy is to hoodwink people and to hustle votes at election time. Just look at the campaign slogans of the different candidates this time. Muskie's campaign slogan this year is, Muskie's the man. And another one that you see on bumper stickers from Muskie is, Believe Muskie. McGovern's slogan in 1972 is, Make America Happen Again. What does that mean? I know some people wondered when it happened to begin with. Nixon's 1968 slogan, you might remember, is "Nixon's the one." And you might even go back as far as Goldwater in 64. His slogan at that time was, "In your heart, you know he's right." Their whole campaign strategy is to build themselves up as individual saviors of the American people. Let me show you the cynicism of their campaigns, just to show you the cynicisms and how they're hoodwinking and tricking you. In a January issue of Newsweek, one of the big shot leaders of the Republican Party explained the tactics of Nixon's campaign in '72, and this is what he said. He said, "Against Muskie, it's a contest of who's more calm and reasonable, Muskie or Nixon." And Nixon's got the record going for him, especially in foreign affairs. "If it's Kennedy, then we say to the people, come on and elect a sane and sensible president, not someone who drives off bridges and cheats on exams." Then he said, "We wouldn't say it quite that way, but that would be the message." He says, "Hubert Humphrey would be running against Lyndon Johnson. Then we'd appeal to the youth vote. Against Jackson, we'd be the peace candidate. We'd run against the big union bosses, and the Democrats would have a fourth party, and we'd win." That's what these campaigns consist of. Images, millions of dollars, and fooling the American people into thinking that there's some significant difference between the Democratic and the Republican parties. You know, the Democrats and the Republicans do have a program. You can go read it. You can go check it out in your library. Their candidates just don't talk about it too much. If they really told people what their program was, nobody would vote for them. Nobody would vote for them. If they were really honest and explained what the capitalist system was doing here and abroad, and then explained that they support that, the American people would be horrified. So they don't do that. Nixon tells the American people, as he did on TV not long ago, that he's a dedicated pacifist from a Quaker background. Humphrey, who, as you know, was LBJ's vice president, tries to pretend that he never heard of the man named LBJ. And both McGovern and McCloskey are still riding on their World War II war medals. When you vote for the Democratic and the Republican parties, what you are essentially doing is giving them a vote of confidence in their system. You are approving the anarchy and the irrationality of the capitalist system. That's what you're doing. Just look at how irrational it is. President Nixon just approved a $5.5 billion space shuttle, while at Willowbrook, the largest home for mentally retarded children in the country that I visited, the children have no clothes, they have no toys, they have no staff. It's like seeing something out of the Dark Ages. This is the wealthiest, richest country that the world has ever known. Yet tens of thousands of school children go to school hungry every day. Over half of our elderly live in absolute poverty and humiliation. Hundreds of thousands of Americans have no access to medical care, and over 6 million Americans can't find work. We have the potential right here in this country to produce enough food to feed every single American citizen and then contribute to countries around the world if they wanted it. But in this country, this government pays farmers not to farm, and some of them aren't really farmers. You have people like Senator Eastland, who calls himself a farmer, got $85,000 last year not to farm his land in Mississippi. The other one who got a lot of money was John Wayne, who also calls himself a farmer. And in this country, if enough wheat is produced to lower the price on the world market, that wheat is burned or dumped into the ocean. Now, maybe some of you are thinking, well, even if the socialists got a fair shake in the elections, even if the elections were democratic, and even if the socialists are absolutely right about everything they say, they still wouldn't win the elections in November '72. And that's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. But why is that? It's because the vast majority of Americans still have illusions in the capitalist system and in the Democratic and the Republican parties. The capitalist system, in fact, depends upon the American people believing in it, accepting it, and voting for it. And the vast majority of Americans still do exactly that. For instance, there were a lot of people who were disappointed that the labor movement didn't act when it was so viciously attacked by Nixon's wage freeze. It's true that it did act to a great extent. And that's because many workers still have illusions in the Democratic Party and in their own bureaucrats like Meany and company who support the Democratic Party. Although I should add that in spite of their illusions, they're still fighting, such as the New York telephone workers' strike shows and the longshoremen's demonstrations show. But as different sectors of American society stop accepting the two-party system, then what you're witnessing is the beginning of the forces in this society that will eventually change this society. And you're seeing the beginnings of that happening right now today. The consciousness of many Americans is beginning to change. Their illusions are being shattered. And they're seeking ways of struggling outside of the two-party system. You see it in the anti-war movement, for instance, or the student movement, and the feminist movement, and the black movement, and the Chicano movement, particularly with La Raza Unida. And you'll see it more and more in the labor movement. As more and more people become involved in these kinds of struggles, their illusions are shed. That's how people change. People change by participating in concrete struggles that are going on. They don't change by voting for the Democratic and the Republican parties. What we have to understand is that in order to be effective in 1972, we have to relate to the struggles that are going on today and to build those movements that actually are changing people's thinking and their consciousness. There are no shortcuts. Now, there are some people who, quite understandably, get very impatient. And they say, well, let's just topple the whole thing right now. Well, you can't topple the whole thing right now because the majority of Americans aren't ready to do it. Then there are other people who also, out of impatience, understandably, say, well, let's just vote for a liberal Democrat and we'll leave it at that. But that's not going to change anything. The effective thing to do is to work outside of the two-party system by building the movements, such as all those movements that I have mentioned, build them independent, in the streets, and against the capitalist system. In other words, what we have to do is build those movements that can reach out to the American people, involve them in action and struggle, and help shed their illusions. And make no mistake about it. Any changes that have ever come or will ever come have come precisely from those kinds of movements. They've never come from the Democratic and the Republican parties. The fight for the 8-hour day took a massive struggle in the streets where several hundred workers were murdered. The fight for public education, it wasn't given to people by the Democratic and the Republican Party. It took mass fights. The fight for the black vote, the fight for the woman's vote, the fight to get the abortion laws repealed. You know, it wasn't John Lindsay that reformed the abortion laws in New York City. It was because 35,000 women took to the streets and forced that law to be changed. The troops that have been withdrawn have not been due to Nixon's kindness, but because of the impact of the massive anti-war movement in this country. That's how changes are made, by masses of people in the streets demanding change. There are 25 million new young voters in this country today. And this youth has the opportunity to be the first sector of society not to be co-opted by the Democratic Party. They co-opted the black vote. They co-opted the woman's vote. They co-opted the labor vote. That's why when this wage freeze hit, there was not one representative of labor in Congress today. Every single senator and congressman, Democrat and Republican alike, supported the wage freeze. But this youth, who know the role that the Democrats and the Republicans have played, and if you don't, go check it out, you'll be betraying everything that you fought for if you vote for them. You can't be for labor and be a Democrat. You can't be a feminist Democrat. You can't be an anti-war Democrat. You can't be for black and brown liberation and be a Democrat. The terms are contradictory. You have to choose. And that's what the Socialist Workers' Party's campaign is all about. Our campaign is the only campaign that is campaigning against the capitalist system. Our campaign is the only campaign that is building on a day-to-day basis all the progressive movements in this country. And our campaign is the only campaign that offers a totally new vision of what kind of society we could build. We're not for just putting a patch here or there on the capitalist system. The system is run solely on the basis of making a profit for a few. That's the end-all and be-all of capitalist society, profits. We're not for patching that up. We're from changing it from top to bottom, and that's the perspective that our campaign offers in 1972. So in my opinion, the most effective thing that people can do in 1972 is join our campaign and help build it. But whether or not you may have disagreements with us on this or that issue, I hope that you will join and participate in the movements that are going on today that will and do have the power in the long run to change this society. And that's what I hope that all of you will do. Thank you.
We will be taking questions now, so we have 2 mics that will go out to anyone who has a question. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand.
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me excuse me. Let me say, as a Marxist and as a Trotskyist, I fully agree with the necessity of pointing out the necessity of an alternative to the Democratic and Republican parties, which is mostly what you spoke about. I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask you, though, about what the SWP has done to do that, especially over the period of the mass struggles that developed in the 60s, and whether or not, you know, what kinds of reasons you think that the way the SWP has done that has been the best way to do it. For instance, in the anti-war movement, on the campuses it became very clear that something was wrong with just students. You know, they couldn't end the war themselves, and as I'm sure the SWP, as the Socialist Workers' Party points out, the necessity of a turn to the working class.
Right.
Yet within the anti-war movement, INPAC and the SMC and the major things that formations within which the SWP has been very prominent has continued, one, to invite the Democrats into the anti-war movement, to allow people like Vance Hartke, to, you know, liberal Democrats, to be in the anti-war movement instead of denouncing them, and secondly, to make most of the approach to labor to be to the trade union bureaucrats who you denounced in your speech. I don't think that those are consistent positions. Secondly, so that's one question about the anti-war movement. Secondly, the strategy that the SWP has consistently put forward and defended is that the tactic of mass marches ought to be lifted to the level of a strategy. That's what we ought to do, mass mobilizations. Yet precisely the effect of the mass mobilizations, you know, time after time after time after time, has been, you know, in and of themselves, I think only to lead to demoralization. So that now people feel, I ain't going to march anymore. It doesn't do any good. And yet the SWP consistently puts that forward. And thirdly, on the issue of racial questions, I'd like to know what your defense has been, or what your defense is, of your consistent support, especially for black nationalism. Because it seems to me that most of the major nationalist theories that came forward in the early 60s have pretty much been discredited, especially in the black community. As more and more blacks see that their fates are tied up with the fates of other white workers, and that the solution does not rest in forming a separate black nation.
Okay. Well, let me just very briefly, on the question of the anti-war movement, you're absolutely right that that we think that there's got to be a mass, there's got to be an organization, such as we support the formation of the National Peace Action Coalition, the Student Mobilization Committee, organizations that will draw together anybody who's for the immediate and total withdrawal of the troops from Vietnam. We think that you have to build a non-exclusionary organization that can encompass people from different walks of life, from different political perspectives, and everybody who's against the war in Vietnam. Now, that's the best way to build an organization that can reach out to all these different sections, get them involved in the anti-war movement, calling for the immediate withdrawal of the troops. That's the nature of building a single-issue coalition. Single-issue coalition where everybody is welcome who agrees with the total immediate withdrawal of the troops. And that's what these groups have done, and we agree that that should be done. That does not mean that we support everybody who's in those coalitions. And to fail to make that distinction is a little blind. For instance, we think that if Vance Hartke wants to participate in the anti-war movement, that he's welcome. That doesn't mean we support Vance Hartke. As a matter of fact, we run against Vance Hartke in all of the elections that come up. We run against these liberal politicians. We run against Bella Abzug. We run against Shirley Chisholm. We run against people who are very popular with the feminists and the black movements and the different movements on the issue of their being in the Democratic Party. So it's a difference as to whether you support the individuals or whether you want to build a single-issue coalition. We think that's the most effective way to demonstrate. Now, on the question of holding demonstrations over and over and over again, see, you hit the nail on the head when you said that the students can't end the war alone. That's absolutely true. Students cannot end the war alone. There are only two sectors that really have the power in and of themselves to end the war. One is the labor people in this country, the working people, and the other is the GIs. We think that you have to build demonstrations, non-exclusionary, peaceful and legal, that will leave the doors open for these sectors of society to come in and demonstrate. Because when the day comes that you have 1 million steel workers and longshoremen out in San Francisco and New York City, the war will end. You have to leave the door open for them to do that. They're not as ready to move as the students are. So you have to keep that door open. Now, on the last question is, in my opinion, the most important question that you raised. And that's the question of our support to the nationalist struggles in this country. And we absolutely do support and will continue to support the black nationalist struggle, Puerto Rican nationalist struggle, the Chicano, the Asian American, and the Native American nationalist struggles. Why do we do that? When black people in this country, let's just take the black as one example, but it's also true of La Raza and the other oppressed nationalities, when they begin demanding black control of the black community and raising other nationalist issues that they're raising, who do they come in conflict with? The people who cannot give them black control of the black communities are capitalists in this country. They cannot grant the demands being raised by the nationalist movements. They cannot grant them. And as these people begin to struggle for their own liberation and for their own control of their own communities, they're going to be headed right up against the capitalist class. That's why we say those struggles are revolutionary. They're revolutionary struggles because it's going to take a revolutionary change for them to grant their demands. Let me make one more point on that. I find it personally a little hard to believe that particularly the student body in America, those sectors of it who agree with you that nationalism is no good, have not been able to look and see at the difference that the nationalist struggles have made in this country. I find it hard to believe that that's escaped you. 15 years ago, blacks in this country, on the whole, there were exceptions, but on the whole, they were shuffling and saying yes, sir. Today, those 25 million people are walking black and proud, and they don't care whether you like it too much or not. This nationalist struggle has changed the thinking and turned 25 million Afro-Americans around. Just the same thing that the Chicano nationalist struggle is doing, and just the same thing that the feminist struggle is doing. Young women today walk different, they talk different, they look different, they feel different about themselves, and it's because of the feminist movement. It's changed the thinking of people. And we say that when any group of people is ready to strike, ready to fight for their liberation, we're on their side. We're on their side. And that's what all these movements are doing. All the nationalist movement and the feminist movement are about people fighting for their own interests and wresting control away from the capitalists in this country, and we totally support them.
We only have time for one more question, but for those of you that are still interested and still have questions, Linda Jenness will be in the men's lounge following the lecture. So we'll take one more question now.
I had only the one question. Is Soviet Union with his one-party system democratic or not? Because I come from Baltic states. When they occupied the Baltic states, they make a ballot, and all other parties was put in jail. Which communism, Maoism, Titoism, Stalinism, or others is the right one?
Right, well, I think it's pretty obvious that the Soviet Union isn't very democratic. There's less democracy in the Soviet Union than there is in the United States today, as a matter of fact, in terms of civil liberties. Why is that? The people of the Soviet Union have, through the revolution of 1917, abolished capitalist property relations. They have a planned economy there, which is superior to this one. I support that. I support the planned economy in the Soviet Union. I think it's proven itself to be superior. What I don't support in the Soviet Union is the bureaucracy that is developed not only there, but in China and all of Eastern Europe, as you correctly pointed out. All of those countries are controlled, ruled, by a very fierce, undemocratic, totalitarian bureaucracy, and I have nothing in common with it. I think it should be booted out and a democratic socialism established in those countries. That's what I'm for, democratic socialism. Let me make this point. Don't throw the baby out with the bath. There are concrete economic, political, and social reasons why the bureaucracies developed in those countries. One of the main ones was poverty, invasions by 23 imperialist countries, including this one in the Soviet Union, uneducated population, whole series of things that you can read about. There are all kinds of books about it, right? The thing is that in this country, we don't face any of those problems. We would not be building socialism on poverty. We'd be building socialism on the most wealthy, industrially, scientifically, technologically advanced society the world has ever known. Nobody would invade us. We don't have a problem of lack of education. We have the possibility right here, for the first time in human history, to build a democratic socialism. I think we can do it. I'll tell you something else. That we can sit around and discuss the possibilities and the problems that are going to arise in establishing democracy, which there are going to be all kinds of questions and problems that we're going to have to work out, right? I don't think it's just going to be easy. But I will say this, that in my opinion, we have no alternative. Because I can guarantee you that unless the people of this country take control out of the hands of the maniacs who have it today, there is not going to be any world. They are leading humanity toward human oblivion, either through nuclear destruction, which is no joke, or environmental destruction, which is also no joke. We have got to take control out of their hands. And I think we can build a democratic socialist society, which is what I'm for. There are reasons why those bureaucracies, they didn't just pop out of the sky or grow out of somebody's ribs. There are reasons for their developing.
IQ in politics, how you say like that. They are too much believing what each candidate promised. They are not right. Even America is not right for true democracy. What is the guarantee that you or other candidate from socialist party is again not a dictator?
Okay, right, right, okay.
Every time I go to a rally like this, there's always a gentleman like him, and I completely respect your position. But there is another socialist country in the world. Why do we always have to look at the Soviet Union? Why don't we look at Sweden?
Okay.
Sweden is, why equate
Sweden.
socialism with dictatorship or authoritarianism? There's socialist democracy.
No, no.
It's your platform. If you want to, that's
Okay,
fine.
let me just,
I don't want to get into a debate here.
see, I think the basic point that the gentleman raised is a basic point that I want to answer, and that is, how, a lot of people say, well, how do we know that you're any different than the Democrats and the Republicans? They make promises, you make promises. There is a difference, and this is what the difference is. The Democrats and the Republicans, come election time, come to you. They come to the anti-war movement, for instance, and they say, look, kids, get political. Get into the Democratic Party. Get off the streets. The Women's Political Caucus comes to young women, says, look, get political. Stop demonstrating. Get into the Democratic Party. We say just the opposite. We say if you want to end this war, you have to build the anti-war movement. If you want your rights as feminists, you have to build a feminist movement. You can't count on them. You can't count on anyone. You have to build your own movements. The difference is this, that the Democrats and the Republicans try to bust up the mass movements and get them off the streets. We try to build the mass movements and keep them in the streets. And that's the difference. We don't say count on us. We don't say count on anybody. We say count on yourselves and your own movements, and you've got to build them. But that's how changes are going to be made.
Thank you all for coming.